Welcome to DadsDivorce Live. I'm Matt Allen, editor of DadsDivorce.com. On today's episode, our guest is Rose McDermott, a professor of political science at Brown University and the former president of the International Society of Political Psychology. She recently worked on a study entitled Breaking Up is Hard to Do, Unless Everyone Else is Doing It Too, which explores how a marriage within a social network can influence others within that network to consider a divorce. Rose, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to talk to you about this study.
Now, what prompted this research to occur? What factors led you and your colleagues to believe divorce contagion is an issue within a group of friends?
Well, I really got the idea because when I got divorced, I started noticing a lot of people around me getting divorced. And they weren't all necessarily close friends. Some of them were coworkers, some of them were friends. But it seemed strange and interesting. And I knew James Fowler from having worked with him before, and I knew that he worked on social networks and did social network analysis and had data on this. And so I saw him at a conference or something, and I asked him if he thought it was possible that that might be some of what's going on. And he kind of laughed at me and said, "I doubt it, but I'm happy to run it for you." And he ran it, and he called me up, and he said, "You're right. It really is there." And so we started to investigate it in a more systematic way. So I guess the real answer is that this is research as me-search. And the really interesting thing is I'm now in a department where I entered the department 4 or 5 years ago as the only single person in the department. And in the last 18 months, there have been 4 divorces, just boom, 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 boom. And it's a relatively small department. And so, I see this phenomenon repeated. And some of it, of course, is a function of age. But I definitely think that there's a contagion effect that's going on that's also real.
And what were the findings of your research?
Well, we found that divorce can spread through social networks in a similar manner to other forms of social contagion like a virus, although Nicholas and James have found it in many other domains, most notably in obesity. That was one of the early studies that demonstrated this. And in this particular instance, it goes through 2 degrees of separation. So you aren't just affected by your friends, but you're affected by your friends' friends, even if you haven't met them. And the risk, of course, is greater for the 1st degree of separation than the 2nd degree of separation. But if your friends or coworkers become divorced, you increase your risk for getting divorced. And if their friends of their friends get divorced, that also increases your risk as well.
So in these social network situations, does gender play a role in who prompts a divorce? Are men or are women more likely to pursue a divorce when one of their friends' marriage ends?
In our particular data, we don't actually have data on that. So in our population study is a population from the Framingham Heart Study, which has been an ongoing study for 30 or 40 years near Framingham, Massachusetts. And we don't actually have data in our study about who instigates the divorce. However, there is unrelated research that I have not done, but that is out there that demonstrates that women are more likely to instigate a divorce than men, which is somewhat counterintuitive because, of course, there's this notion when we're younger that women are the ones who want to get married and men are the ones who, don't want to commit. But once people are married, it appears to be that women are more likely to instigate divorce. And that's particularly true the longer people are married or the older that they are.
And finally, what can couples do to work through their own relationship when they see their friends and others within their social network going through a divorce?
Well, I think that, there's various kinds of research on this, not all of which comes out of our work. So our work really describes the phenomenon and says that it exists, but doesn't necessarily explain why it exists or generate any reasonable empirical results to avoid it. However, there is other research that looks into this, and there's speculation that, you can render based on that research about what's going on. So, for example, the question that you just asked about gender differences, some of the most interesting work that I've seen shows that part of the reason you get these gender differences is that men and women have very different goals for what they want to achieve out of relationships. So in marriage, for example, what men seem to really want is somebody to do stuff with, and also the external validation for professional jobs that comes with being married. So in other words, if you're married, your community sees you as more reliable and more responsible, and you can, especially in traditional organizations like law firms and so on, are more likely to advance quickly and without opposition if you're married. So those things are sort of external, I think of them as external values in the relationship. And what women want tend to be these internal values, to have sort of deep dyadic emotional engagement. And so one can see how those activities, while they can sometimes overlap, may also cause some divergence in what people want out of their relationship. And so if one person is getting what they want and the other person isn't, that can lead to fissures that over time can increase risk of divorce. So I think with regard to our study and with regard to the larger research that's out there, one of the things to think about is both that when you see friends of yours starting to have relationship difficulties, if you support them in ways that try to help their relationship, you're actually helping your own relationship, right? So if they don't divorce, you actually protect the likelihood that you'll be less likely to get divorced. So rather than sort of spurring them on to get divorced, I mean, obviously there are circumstances where it may be necessary, like with abuse or something, but if it's just sort of normal difficulties like everybody experiences over the course of a long-term relationship, trying to support and encourage the relationship in your friends also indirectly supports and encourages your own relationship. And of course, the important work is to do the important work in your own relationship to make sure that you're doing what you can to meet your partner's needs and that you're telling your partner what needs you need to have be met in a way that will allow the relationship to be rich and rewarding and enduring for both of you.
Well, Rose, thank you very much for joining me today, and we all appreciate your work looking into this issue of divorce within a social network.
I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about this study. Thanks so much for having me on.
That was Rose McDermott, a professor of political science at Brown University and author of a recent study entitled "Breaking Up is Hard to Do Unless Everyone Else is Doing It Too." That'll do it for this edition of Dad's Divorce Live. I'm Matt Allen, editor of DadsDivorce.com.